Good afternoon. So first, let me thank you for taking a couple of hours out of your afternoon to attend this event. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Tony Janetos. I'm the director of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes introducing this afternoon's session and talk a little bit about why it's actually so important to think concretely about adaptation strategies. And then when I conclude, I'm going to introduce our two primary speakers who will each speak for about 20 minutes. The three of us will then migrate over to the tables over here, and we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A session. Let me just begin by talking for a minute about the Pardee Center itself. Our mission is really twofold, and one is interdisciplinary research on a range of issues those issues that essentially cause the world to unfold the way it does. We have a concern for the coming decades, not just for understanding the way the world is today, but how will it evolve, and how well do we understand those issues? And secondly, how do we actually translate that knowledge and disseminate that scholarly pursuit into knowledge that can actually help make decisions better? So that decisions that are made today can actually lead to better outcomes as the world moves forward. So this is really a twofold mission for the center. What I want to primarily focus on, though, in the brief time that I'll be up here, is why are adaptation strategies so important. This is an important feature of a big chunk of the research agenda for the center, in particular research on global environmental change. And one reason they're so important is that if you look, for example, at the last big scientific assessment from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and in particular from Working Group 2, which is the group of scientists who worry about impacts and vulnerability and adaptation, you'll see that there's really, in this little cartoon, there's really nowhere in the world where we don't have well-documented evidence of impacts of global change on natural resources, on agriculture, on water resources, on human health, on natural ecosystems. It's just, this is really now emerged out of a theoretical concern into a very real concern and documented impacts literally around the world. There are many possible responses to this. This is one. I don't actually recommend it. But it also leads us to think about how do we actually adapt. This I've stolen from the response to Katrina, but it has a serious point, is that we're starting to see new policy directions emerge out of the noise. And really what we're seeing are the importance of adaptation policies and practices beginning to take hold as the climate system itself continues to change and as impacts become more and more apparent. John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, has outlined three choices. We can mitigate, that is, reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, we can adapt, or we can suffer the consequences. These are not, however, mutually exclusive. And we're now in a situation where both private adaptation, that is, those decisions that individual firms or individuals make, and public policy about adaptation are beginning to emerge domestically and internationally as well. There's lots of local action. If you look, for example, at cities around the U.S., many cities have, and even some regions have established climate action plans, all of which have some important component regarding adaptation to change. This is especially true here in Boston, where the vulnerability of the waterfront and the vulnerability of Boston as a coastal community, as a coastal city, is high on the political decision makers' list of concerns for the future. This has also been an important topic at the Pardee Center, and it's one that we will return to. We've spent a lot of time on, and that we will continue to return to. We've had seminars on contingent adaptation in South Asian megacities, a major conference jointly with the Initiative on Cities on sea level rise and the future of coastal cities. And in rural areas, in this case in Southeast Asia, in the Mekong, a look at the potential climate impacts along with impacts of dam building on freshwater availability, on flood cycles, and on food supplies through freshwater fisheries in the developing world. But what questions should we really ask? It's one thing to say, to do a set of studies, climate change will affect forests, climate change will affect fish, climate change will affect precipitation and floods and drought. But if we have, in fact, directional goals, improving the human condition, advancing progress, reducing poverty, enhancing security, it might make more sense to ask whether a changing climate makes achieving these goals more difficult or easier, or whether changing climate policy makes achieving those goals more difficult or easier. And this means engaging science in the policy process rather differently than we've done over the past decades, where we begin to look for synergies instead of insisting that one issue or another must always have the prime position, where we start to move away from simply describing all the ways that the climate system interacts with resources and sectors that we care about, and towards acknowledging that our fundamental goals and values are in this directional context, and actually starting to restructure both research programs and policy programs to understand the processes that can actually start to bend the curve and create a more secure and more prosperous environment. This also means engaging different communities than we might be used to doing. That is, engaging the food security community, development agencies, the national security community, the disaster relief communities, in addition to the scientific communities and the physical, biological, ecological, and social sciences that we're all used to, and the scientific communities that support these important issues. We are starting to see both literature and experience starting to emerge. There is a substantial amount of change that's in effect baked into the climate system already. So we will continue to see change. And we really need the construction of analytical methods for understanding the risks, the benefits and trade-offs that are inherent in policy choices. This is not a strict cost-benefit issue, but it is instead an issue of managing risks. And having a clearer articulation of policy scenarios and the implications of those scenarios, and a clearer articulation of the scientific agenda that increasingly supports analysis and decision-making, in addition to understanding the world. It's not enough just to be interesting. It's also not enough to wait for perfect knowledge. We cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So let me just finish up. We need to acknowledge that the world is not going to wait. In a sense, Mother Nature doesn't care how rapidly we advance our state of knowledge. We have already caused change. We will continue to cause change. We need to start making the best decisions we can, make them incrementally better as we continue to learn about the processes in the world that we're not so sure about. We must acknowledge that we're managing risks as well as seeking to understand the world better, and that this is really the very epitome of being useful while also being interesting. So let me finish by introducing our speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Richard Moss. Richard is a senior research scientist at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, which is a creation of the Pacific Northwest National Lab and the University of Maryland. We had a small pool as to whether I could get all of that out in one breath. I've known Richard since approximately the late Pleistocene. He's had a fascinating career. He has undergraduate degrees in public policy and graduate degrees in public policy and international relations. And really, almost since getting his PhD, he has become increasingly enmeshed in working with physical scientists, natural scientists, and working on these challenges of how the social dimensions and human dimensions of global change interact with the physical dimensions of change, and how we think about impacts, adaptation, and response strategy. Richard spent several years as the director of the Technical Support Unit for IPCC Working Group 2. He currently, amongst many other activities, chairs a board at the National Academy of Sciences on environmental science and change, otherwise known as the Human Dimensions Board, and has had in addition to all of that, has had a distinguished research career trying to understand the processes that lead to vulnerabilities, the processes that can reduce vulnerabilities, how decision makers actually think about complex environmental issues, and especially those of global change. He was a member of the Federal Advisory Committee, the Advisory Committee for the recently published National Climate Assessment, and was the primary author on an excellent chapter on decision support. Our second speaker is Kira Sullivan-Wiley. Kira is a PhD candidate in the Department of Earth and Environment here at BU. She also was a summer fellow last year at the Pardee Center. Kira's research is really focused on the rural poor in Africa and trying to understand how they make decisions about reducing their own vulnerability. Where do they get their information? Who's a trusted source? How does that work? And so we'll have an interesting, I think, contrast of views. Kira, actually, I've discovered, actually began her career as a biologist, as an ecologist, decided that wasn't mathematical enough, went and got a master's degree working with climate scientists and climate modelers at Columbia University, and as much as Richard has migrated from the human dimension side to working with physical scientists, Kira's migration is working in the other direction, as she works more and more on the human dimension side of these complex environmental problems. Kira is also the Simon Moorman Civic Fellow, an honor bestowed by members of our BU's Board of Trustees for graduate students who are particularly oriented towards, in a sense, discharging their civic responsibilities. And so we're very proud to have her as our second speaker. So with no further ado, let me sit down and yield the floor to Richard.
Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here. It's great to be at a university where you have a center that's intending to look at the longer range future. It's really exciting to look at how you can bring the necessary scholarship together and integrate it, and I applaud Tony's leadership in directing the center. So what I want to start with is just a few motivational slides. So this is a slide that's taken from the recent National Climate Assessment that Tony referred to, and it's just an illustration of the frequency with which different states have seen climate or weather disasters where the damages have totaled more than $1 billion. And this is a cumulative picture. It's not showing a trend. And I can't actually recall whether when NCDC put this figure, the National Climatic Data Center, together, they controlled carefully for size and all of that. But the point that you really should take away is that there's a variety of factors that underlie these sorts of billion-dollar disasters. Some of them have to do with climate, but many of them have to do with where we're putting infrastructure, who's living on the coasts, what the preparedness is of different economic sectors or different regions of the country to deal with storms. And I think that the main thing I want you to take away is sort of thinking about the fact that as if we look at this over time, certainly we are going to see an increase in severity and frequency of some of the climate events that precipitate these disasters. It's really up to us whether or not we see this damage increase over time, or whether or not we do things and build the infrastructure in a way that makes it more resilient, and that we are working with communities to make sure that these sorts of climate events, as they become more frequent, don't also become the occasion of a lot more economic loss and loss of life and other things we hold dear. The second thing you probably will not be able to read, even in the front row, but so Tony mentioned that I was the principal author on one of the assessment chapters that looked at decision making, particularly related to adaptation. in the National Climate Assessment. And one of the things I did after the fact was go back and look across multiple chapters of the National Climate Assessment at the types of decision-making that people are talking about now having to make as a result of climate change. And they're talking about having to include climate information in decisions that before they really didn't have to think about it because climate was a stationary factor. So you look across these things you see in water resources, things that you might think of as having a climate component, but that are more complicated now because it's not a stationary climate component. Planning reservoir capacity. People talk about managing water levels in the Great Lakes now, improving drought preparedness all across the country in multiple regions. You can look at transportation where people are concerned about engineering fixed route infrastructure so that it is built to accommodate increases in sea level or accommodate stronger storms. Increasing resilience of airports vulnerable to storm surge, something that may be of interest here in Boston. Or environmental conservation, a completely different area where people are now, and I spent some time at the World Wildlife Fund trying to work on this, people are now beginning to think about as we design conservation areas, we need to start thinking about where will there be refugia that enable certain species to continue to exist even after the climate has shifted. And so there's long-term planning and budgeting that these conservation organizations are involved with that have to now take account of climate change. So one of the things that as a scientist I'm concerned about is that there's a lot more that the science community understands that would be relevant to these sorts of decisions that's not yet in the hands of decision makers. And I wanted to quote this article from a colleague, Marie Carmen Lemos, on narrowing the climate information usability gap. And their research based on some social science analysis suggests that there is a gap between what scientists understand as useful and what users recognize as usable. And that the work, that I think it indicates that we really have to start rethinking the ways that we design and promote use-inspired applied research programs if we're in fact going to meet the information needs that are out there. So this is something that's motivated a lot of my career, and I've got a number of research projects on it. The one that Tony asked me to kind of talk about today was a project that was funded by the Department of Defense. So this is going to be a completely different kind of talk than you hear as the second talk. This is a large bureaucracy. It manages a huge amount of infrastructure, as I'll point out. And what they asked us to do, we collaborated with colleagues at the National Center for Atmospheric Research on developing and testing methods that would give them information to better manage the vulnerability of their installations and facilities. So this arises from the fact that the President has issued an executive order requiring all of his departments and agencies to, in fact, start to do this. And so they have a huge task. DoD runs 7,000 different sites across just the United States. 510 of these are active installations. It's 25 million acres of land that's used for different kinds of training and deployment purposes, and millions of individuals. It's not just those who are being trained in the armed services, it's also their families who live on a lot of these installations that they have to be providing standard services that any urban area has to provide. So it's really a complex challenge that they confront. So what we did is we undertook a project that looked at kind of areas of how do you assess the condition of these installations in ways that tells you something about current and potential future vulnerability. How can you tailor the climate information that we have from climate models and observations to make it relevant? And then how can you apply this information in decision making? So the map, which is a little washed out, unfortunately, as it's projected here, displays 4 of the sites that we worked on. This is the Naval Academy, here Chesapeake Bay in Washington, D.C., Joint Base Langley-Eustis, the Dare County Bombing Range, which is almost unique on the East Coast in providing an area for our Air Force and Navy aviators to train, and then Fort Bragg. So there's a range of conditions that these sites face. And you can also imagine, I'm not going to go into it in detail, that there's a range of missions that they're trying to support and activities that are going to be affected in different ways by climate change. The one drawback I have in giving this talk is that some of the data that we were able to get access to is still undergoing a I don't want to say declassification, it's not all classified, but there's a sensitivity in the department for us to talk about some of this until they've actually had a careful opportunity to scrub it. So it's not to change the conclusions, just to make sure we're not releasing anything that they consider to be sensitive. So I won't be able to give as many hard results as I would like. So we had a very simple technical approach. It involved meeting both with the people on the bases as well as people at the headquarters organizations to kind of scope out what each of our vulnerability assessments would look at. This involves characterizing assets, looked at how do we extract information about the sites from existing management systems, and also interviews with the personnel who are managing the sites. Based on what we learned was important, what climate features mattered to those 4 sites, we then actually worked with our colleagues at NCAR to extract the information that was needed, bringing all of this together in different methods to both modeling in complex ways as well as kind of more simple heuristics to assess what's vulnerable. And then we did this over the case studies and then developed the guidelines that we were requested to work on. So I want to just kind of talk briefly about each of the 5 questions that motivated this. First, about baseline vulnerability. So the objectives of this phase of a vulnerability assessment really are to engage stakeholders, collect information, and then identify climate information needs. And there's quite a bit that you may have heard about with the Department of Defense kind of leading our nation and being willing to consider this as an issue. And when you look kind of at the headquarters level, that is certainly the case. When you get down below that, particularly at some of the installations in the Southeast, it turns out not to be fully the case that all of the members of the staffs at these installations believe climate change is an issue. And so you have to be willing to engage and use a variety of engagement methods, which I'll talk about in a second. In terms of collecting information, it's information about the assets and activities themselves. It's about it's things like the current condition. It's putting together information on past damages from observed extreme events. And it's about getting information on the ways that they have available to them to adapt. And so, what we learned as we went through this, doing it at the installations, was that there was this really big variance in the perception of how important climate change was. And, it was really shocking to us. Some of the places where people were still saying this is not a problem were also installations that were multiple times a year experiencing closure of different facilities, for example, flooded runways, as a result of climate events. And that it was still such a politically charged issue that led them to not accept that this was an issue for them to face in their own management decisions was really astounding to us. We did find that there was a difference that some staff were more willing to talk about this if we didn't bring up human attribution. Right, so if this doesn't have anything to do with greenhouse gas emissions and Al Gore, it's okay to talk about, but as soon as they think that it has something to do with that, they don't want to go there. And as a result of that, the obvious implication, if you're somebody who's worried about helping the Department of Defense or really any other installation develop methods, is that you have to tailor those methods so that it speaks to the level of interest and the type of starting point that your interrogators are bringing to this. And that we found that you needed sort of 2 broad categories of information methods. One, really where you're just extracting information from people who may not even be willing to give you too much of it. And that speaks to one set of approaches. And then the more desired approach that you see in the literature is communication, which is more about 2-way information exchange and things that could involve scenario planning methods and that sort of thing, where people are actually engaging much more actively. And those indeed are valuable methods for some places in the department. It was really, even on these well-managed installations, it was very difficult to get the data that we needed. You'd be surprised at how little information about climate change damages or closures is connected. There are sites that collect information about when is a training area closed, when can't we use it. If you ask them to try to explain it, it could be anywhere from, well, we had a Boy Scout troop visiting that day and they were out on that range so we couldn't use it, to, well, there was flooding on that range and we couldn't send people out there. And there's no information currently being collected in many of these systems, and it's something that we're trying to work with the department to remedy. But I expect it's not unique just to the Department of Defense, and the broader point really is that it's hard to get some of the information we need. Another thing that was important was there were a lot of reports, existing data sets, oftentimes not containing the most accurate information about current conditions on a base. And that cut both ways. In one case, we were looking at reports that indicated erosion was a huge problem at a particular site. And when we went on the site, it turned out it wasn't. And part of the reason may have been that the report that cited erosion as a big problem served as a foundation for a funding request. And lo and behold, when we went and talked about how does erosion affect climate vulnerability, wasn't a problem anymore. So it just points out that you have to kind of verify. You can use this stuff, but you have to verify it. And then finally, the thing that we found also challenging was adaptive capacity. You think about what adaptive capacity is. Sure, it's access to funding, it's access to training, it's things like that. It's the ability to change infrastructure, but it also has a lot of intangible elements, leadership, organizational culture, mindset, and those things are really much more difficult to measure. And then finally, we also talk a lot about observing through data when do damages occur, what are the climate thresholds. Those also turn out to be very difficult to identify in site visits or other data, simply because there's oftentimes multiple co-occurring events, and teasing out exactly what the climate component of that is not easy. So in terms of the second area, decision-making, here we really set out to try to identify what climate information is already being used and to develop a taxonomy of decision-making and think about ways that that could be improved. I think that we learned that there is a lot of information being used in sort of active management, but traditional decision analysis tools did not turn out to be of great importance. And so what we ended up doing in our approach was to focus more on longer-term decision-making processes like development of master plans, integrated natural resources management planning, a set of training area plans that are developed, and look at how climate information can be brought into those. And that's really required a redirection of our effort, and that's going to be continued in a follow-on project. And is very consistent with some results from the Government Accountability Office that indicate kind of the importance of integrating climate information into existing management structures and systems. The third area about tailoring climate information. Here we took a particular approach. You notice that all of our installations were within one region. The idea is that we were going to develop what we called climate outlooks that addressed specific information needs, for example, related to fire risk or wind speeds, storm environments, those kinds of things, where it's not the main thing that a climatologist necessarily analyzes, but the climate model runs contain all of the components that you need to start calculating these more impact-oriented indices. And so we decided to use this kind of regional approach where we could look across multiple different types of models and pull together the information from global models, regional models, and so forth, include assessment of confidence, discuss where models agreed and disagreed and how, which we found that was something that a lot of users really seemed to want. They didn't, they'd say, well, model A says this, model B gives me a different answer, which model do I believe? And the point is that until you really analyze which models are producing and representing different climate processes in different ways, and going through an analysis of that that's oriented towards giving people information for the decisions, it's hard to actually pull all of that together. So, this is just an example. For example, at the Naval Academy, there's a lot of flooding events that occur when sort of southeasterly winds occur and push a lot of water up the bay. The Academy is kind of located right at the end of the bay, so all of that water pushes up there. There turned out to be 4 different types of meteorological patterns that give rise to this, and so the project, having identified this as a problem, analyzed different climate model intercomparison archives for the occurrence of these 4 conditions and sort of tried to give information about, as we look across climate models, do we see them happening more frequently? Another index that we used, and there were a lot of them, was related to something called the wet bulb globe temperature, which gives you information on different types of activity restrictions associated not only with temperature, but humidity, insulation, and other things. So we were able to kind of pull this information together. We felt the approach worked, although it's still being evaluated. And one of the things I just wanted to point out, this is a picture of a web page, a screen capture from a web page put out by the administration and about NOAA that really has different climate information tools. So it's Climate Explorer, Climate Inspector, Climate Wizard. A lot of these things are, put out there without a lot of testing. One of the things that I prepared is recently just published an article on climatic change that looks at the possible role of the future national climate assessment in starting to evaluate tools like this to make sure that they're following basic rules of decision support and how this information should be applied and provided. So in terms of the development of actual methods for testing future vulnerability, we really tried to pull together and test a range of approaches. Some of them are going to be more complex and involve very high resolution modeling. Others are going to need to be quite simple and heuristic and do simple statistical analysis of return periods, for example, or use of GIS layers to try to give people an impression. And the degree of complexity of method depends on the value of the asset, the type of planning that's going to be used. Is this a preliminary scoping exercise or something where we're trying to develop a final adaptation plan? And so, the sites that we looked at showed a mix of vulnerability. We felt that the installation assets that we were conducting were valuable in some ways to participants, but not in others, and that led us to make changes in our method. This point that I made earlier just about decision-making needing to integrate this information needing to be integrated into ongoing decision-making. And then one final point I'll make really about the stakeholders' involvement in this is that people always say stakeholder engagement is a panacea. And for many of these installations where there are security and security concerns or what have you, you really need to target stakeholder engagement more on, say, providers of key resources, so electric utilities, water resources utilities, providers and partners in that sense, and it needs to be issue-driven. So I had some other points I wanted to make about the actual process that we evolved. Maybe I'll just show one slide that kind of talks about one of the insights we had, which is when you look at any big institution, we started out asked to do these installation vulnerability assessments. It quickly became obvious to us that those aren't going to be able to be done even on all 500 of the bigger installations. And so they really need to have a kind of tiered process where this is a high-level course screening activity that's using existing data sets and indicators. And so we've done a lot of work now on developing some quantitative indicators using real property master planning and those kinds of things. The site level work, which was at this level that we did focus on. And then there's going to be a need for even more detailed engineering studies. And Tony early in his introduction talked about bringing in different communities. One of the ones he didn't mention, I think it's not out of anything other than just having not thought about it, is engineering and architecture. These are going to be crucial for any sort of vulnerability and adaptation planning process for anything that has to do with infrastructure or urban areas. And so maybe I'll just close with this slide and say that there are a lot of methods underlying each of these different broad approaches, some stakeholder engagement, some climate information related, and some that are related to actual impact analysis and modeling at various scales of complexity. We're going to need to continue to develop all three of these areas. And my personal view is that this isn't just relevant for things like institutions like the Department of Defense. It's also going to be really important, whether it's developed or developing country, to have a range of these kinds of well-worked-out methods that we can work with colleagues across engineering, architecture, and other fields to implement. So, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I'd like to reiterate what Richard said in terms of, I think it's fantastic that the Pardee Center put this event together. I think it's a great conversation to be having here at BU. I'm honored to be a part of it, and I'm actually very much looking forward to the panel portion. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting overlaps between the two talks. So as Tony said in his very kind introduction of me, I'm going to be talking today a little bit about adaptation in a developing context. So we've heard a lot about what it looks like in the developed world, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and dissertation that I've been doing in eastern Uganda, so in a setting very different from the current discussion. And so as I go through, I'm going to give a little bit of a background on adaptation in the developing world, and then I'll go through the case study of my research in eastern Uganda, and then maybe some lessons learned and ways to move forward. And as I go through, there are going to be a few themes that come up that I wanted to give up front so they can be sort of in your minds as we move forward. And one is that climate change, this trend that we're talking about, adaptation to climate change, is really layered on top of existing climate variability. And this is especially, maybe not especially important in the developing world, but certainly very important in the developing world and something that we need to keep in mind. And that also provides both a challenge and an opportunity. Also, that when we think about adaptation in the developing world, the capacities and motivations of the target populations are not homogeneous. They're not the same across. They're variable. And this becomes very important when we talk about the strategies we're using to get people to adapt and the adaptation strategies we're asking people to adopt. And sort of it means that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to adaptation in the developing world. And that addressing these challenges, I hope you'll agree by the end of the talk, requires clarity in the climate change adaptation message and the way it gets translated from scientists and people like those who work for the IPCC down to farmers on the ground who are going to be managing. We have to adopt appropriate solutions and build trust among stakeholders, which I'll talk more about as the talk goes on. But basically, so climate change and vulnerability and adaptation in the developing world can have a very different face on it than what it looks like in a developed country like the United States. And largely this comes down to the fact that so especially in rural areas in the developing world, the majority of people, or many people, are going to be relying on agriculture for their livelihoods. There's a lot of subsistence and small scale agriculture that goes on. And this livelihoods challenge, that's a livelihood that's very strongly tied to changes in the climate, in climate variability and in climate change, rainfall especially, and temperature to some extent, temperature affecting sort of evapotranspiration rates, germination times, things like that. But rainfall, the timing and the magnitude of rainfall is very important. As anyone who has a garden knows or has seen a farm. Rainfall magnitude, if there's too much rainfall, too little, if the timing is off, it can affect yields and productivity, very important for small-scale farmers. And also, timing and magnitude of rainfall can affect a lot of natural disasters or natural hazards. So flooding, drought, rain, soil erosion, mudslides, landslides, all these things are impacted by precipitation and the amount and timing of precipitation. And so this is a small graph taken from a paper by Stamponi and colleagues that just shows that this is for a town in Uganda, not one of the ones that I work in. We don't have a graph like this for there. But this is just showing variability, right? So you have interseasonal or seasonal variability, sort of the bimodal distribution of rainfall throughout the year. But then also within each month, you see quite large error bars, right? So this is talking about sort of within each month, even if you can expect there's a rainy season here, exactly when you plant your crops, even the day matters. If the rains are coming too early or too late, the timing of planting, the timing of harvesting, timing of weeding, all of these things can be affected. Also the timing of natural disasters. If the rainfall is all clustered close together, increased risk of some of these climate-related challenges. And so this is important, right? Expectations of when and where rainfall is going to happen is layered on top of this climate change, right? There's variability, there's sort of a lot of noise in the system, and then a potential trend. And so this is an excerpt from, again, sort of working group 2 in the AR5, in the most recent IPCC report, talking about expectations of a wetter climate with more intense wet seasons and less severe droughts. But then later on, a comment that one of the regional climate models suggests drying over parts of Uganda. So this is the East Africa portion. And so there's quite a significant amount of uncertainty in sort of the direction and magnitude of where change is going to be And part of this, so this is an example from East Africa and from Uganda, but part of the uncertainty is based in a lack of data, a lack of a paucity of good historical climatological data in many parts of the developing world. And so it's not a problem unique to Uganda. I just use Uganda here as an example. And so to illustrate this, right, I didn't come up with this concept, this idea of variability and a trend in climate change being an overlapping issues. So this is also from the IPCC report, so this is just built up. These are sort of two lenses with which you can approach vulnerability, right? So the idea of adaptation is that we're adapting to some sort of vulnerability in the system, and so, or for people to climate change. And this is the idea that the climate change perspective and the vulnerability perspective are looking at sort of adaptation to future climate change and scenarios for future climate change is the climate change impacts perspective, and the vulnerability perspective saying, you know, we need to approach current climate variability, current vulnerabilities. And so this is sort of, can be thought of as the long-term versus the short-term, right? Vulnerability and approaches to vulnerability and climate variability deal with the now, the challenges that people are currently facing in the developing world. And then adaptation to future challenges are sort of what we can expect them, the vulnerabilities to be years from now, sort of at the end of the 20th century or 21st century. And so these two things are overlapping, and the ways that we address them, in many cases it's through development, right? One of the principal approaches that we have now to addressing current variability and current vulnerability deals with development, right? Getting people out of poverty, getting them food secure. And so these are the 17 new sustainable development goals that came out a couple of months ago, I think in September. And sort of this is the vision for how we're going to focus our development efforts over the next 15 years. And here you can see point 13 is climate action. And one of the sub-targets of that is strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. So that's including developing countries. And this is sort of, again, this idea that variability and vulnerability are linked. Current vulnerability, climate variability is impacting people, but it's also layered on top of future change. And so if we're going to be addressing one, we need to be addressing the other also. They're coupled. So I investigate this in this area of Uganda. So Uganda, I'm over here. And if we zoom in, so these are two districts of eastern Uganda that I work in. And this is an area, it's the Bugisu subregion, and it's dominated by Mount Elgon, an extinct volcano, really rich soils, bimodal rainfall, plenty of rainfall in general. And by and large, the people here are reliant on small-scale agriculture for their livelihoods. Upwards of 90% of the population relies on small-scale agriculture directly for their livelihoods. And and they're also, so this area is at risk of from many natural hazards, so including some of the ones that I've named already, but flooding, mudslides, soil erosion, landslides, some of the more common ones. And these are in some cases already being exacerbated by population dynamics. So population growth here is relatively high, and the tendency is to move up the slope as populations increase. People move onto increasingly steep slopes, which exacerbates some of the natural hazard likelihoods. And then also potentially being exacerbated by climate change, trends in climate, in precipitation, especially towards the end of the century, though the magnitude and direction of that is not completely clear. So people here are vulnerable both in the present to climate variability and also long-term to climate change. And so to this challenge rush many helping hands. In the area where I work, all of these agencies and then some are active. They all have programs there that are being currently implemented to try to address these vulnerabilities on the ground. They run the gamut, right? There are some aid agencies that are focused on disaster risk reduction, some development agencies focused on market-based tools to reduce poverty, and from civic to government agencies, community-based to international, they run the gamut. But many of them do agree. They sort of are broadly aware that the variability and the trend are coupled, that they're dealing with both current challenges as well as future trends. And in many cases, too, they agree on what's to be done about it. So in some of the interviews that I did, so in my study area, I conducted interviews with many of these agencies as well as household surveys with farmers on the ground. And one of the things that came out was, so migration is one of the things that gets purported as being one of the potential solutions, right? People are at risk in this particular area, move them out, get them somewhere else. They should live elsewhere. If it's voluntary, largely those strategies have not worked. They didn't work here. There was a landslide back in 2010. People moved after it, and then many of them just moved right back a year or two later. So if we accept that people have to adapt in place, that people are going to be adapting where they already exist in the homes that they have already, the focus shifts then more towards management and preparedness. And to do that, a set of sort of best management practices emerged from many of the conversations that I had, the interviews that were conducted, and these included things like digging contours across the land, right? Land management, digging contours on the land, adopting intercropping, digging trenches or holes to capture water, tree planting, afforestation was a big one. And these all were seen as being beneficial in terms of reducing vulnerability in the short term, sort of reducing risks of soil erosion, things like that, but also in terms of boosting productivity, which is an economic advantage for the long term. So 4 of the ones I'm going to focus on today are these, with pretty pictures that I took of examples of what they look like in the field. So tree planting, trenches, digging trenches, intercropping, and contouring the land are all seen as sort of reducing risks of natural hazards in place, and also improving productivity on the land, which is seen as spurring economic development is seen as one of the, if we don't know exactly what to expect from long-term climate change, as we do here, we're not sure exactly the direction, the magnitude of the changes, one of the sort of best ways that's seen to increase people's adaptive capacity, their ability to cope with different changes in the future, is to help them be more economically sound, right, to build their wealth. And so all of these are seen as doing that by increasing productivity, and so giving people whose livelihoods is based on crop production more productivity. So these are great. These are great adaptation strategies. These are good behaviors that people should adopt, and there are many, many agencies in the area trying to encourage farmers to adopt these through a variety of different programs. And so one of the things that we investigated over the course of my study was whether or not this is actually happening. Are people changing their behavior? Are they adapting? Are they adopting and adapting? And so as you can imagine, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are successes and there are failures. And so I'm going to focus on successes first because lead with positivity. So one of the successes, so there was a program that we looked at in one of the villages. It was actually a joint, so this village achieved nearly 100% adoption of contouring. So contouring being one of these sort of best management strategies for addressing current and future vulnerability. And I think with the exception of 1 or 2 households, everyone in the village responded that they had adopted contouring as a strategy. And it was the program that we'd been investigating in that town, or in that village, was a joint venture funded by the WWF, by the World Wildlife Fund, and implemented locally by a local chapter of the Ministry of Water and Environment. And it was a very strongly focused program. The program was very targeted. It gave training and incentives for people to use just contouring. They emphasized contouring as the one goal of their program. It was a very strong, very focused program, which was appropriate for the village that we were working in. It's a village, the entire thing is on a relatively steep slope on the side of a mountain. And the program also achieved, in addition to high levels of adoption, horizontal learning. So we saw that even people who didn't identify as direct beneficiaries of the program, they hadn't been paid by the program, they hadn't received those direct incentives, but they still had adopted the use of contours and credited the program as being sort of the source of their information, the source of their knowledge, which is an indication that maybe there was a sort of diffusion of the benefit outside of the direct beneficiaries. And people adopted for different reasons. So throughout the course of the study, we asked people sort of, when you do adopt a strategy, what's driving that behavior? Why are you choosing to do what you do? And over half of the people in this town, or in this village, were looking to reduce soil erosions. They were avoiding a risk. They were contouring to reduce, to practice soil conservation and reduce soil erosion. But about a third were seeking yield benefits. They wanted increased yields. They wanted to increase their productivity. And then there were a handful of others who were doing it because, so along the edges of contours, often people plant elephant grass or Napier grass and use it as fodder for cows. So for one person, that was the benefit they were seeking from digging contours or planting contours. Another wanted it for water storage. So there are sort of multiple benefits that people can seek from doing the same behavior, and which can be very important for adaptation. And also people, regardless of why they were adopting the behavior, regardless of this motivation, they felt that they were making a change. We asked them sort of, does it work? Do you feel like you've made a difference by adopting the contour or whatever it was? And again, nearly everyone had the highest level of achievement. They said, like, yes, I feel that it's very successful. It does address the challenge that I wanted it to address, which is a sort of empowering message. That people felt that they had a need, they felt that this tool that they were being given addressed that need, they implemented the tool, and they felt that it made a difference. And so in this village, this was very successful, but there are areas where the messaging and the sort of the adaptation and vulnerability reduction program falls short. And so in some villages we asked, so for people who didn't adopt whatever strategy we were asking, we asked them why they didn't adopt. What's preventing people from adopting? And in some cases, it's a lack of interest. They're like, oh, I don't want to do that one. I don't have an interest in it. But that was fairly rare. Most people had expressed some interest, but then an actual constraint, a sort of physical constraint. In many cases, so the bulk of all constraints could be considered sort of capacity deficits. So either a deficit in knowledge. People said that they didn't know enough. They didn't feel that they had sufficient knowledge to implement the strategy, either what the strategy was itself, sort of how it worked, or what it was addressing, or sort of physical or material deficits, either in terms of cash, land, or time and energy, which comes to the point that that capacity is variable, right, amongst these populations. Not everyone has the same amount of money or land to spend on different on these different strategies, and all the strategies cost something. The ones I've shown today don't really cost money, except for the trees, though those are heavily subsidized. Most of them cost energy. They cost time and labor and land. So if there's a subsistence farmer who decides to take 10% of their land and allocate it to a contour or to tree planting that they aren't going to cut down, or to trenches, that's 10% potentially of their revenue stream that's going away. And so there are trade-offs. There's sort of near-term, long-term trade-offs, and there are also trade-offs in terms of resources. People who are choosing to not adopt a particular thing aren't just not adopting that. You have to look at sort of the suite of things that they might actually be adopting in place of that, how they're allocating their resources. Some people also just said that they thought that the intervention was inappropriate for their purposes. And in some cases, this was just sort of land, like, oh, contouring's not important on my land. It's not necessary. The slope isn't steep enough. But in other cases, people actually thought that these things that were widely regarded as being best management strategies were actually going to produce a negative effect for them. And so some of this can come down to mixed messages. So for the most part, there was agreement among the organizations that I interviewed about sort of what the best management strategies are and what we should be shooting for, what the goals should be. But there was disagreement, especially when it came to the sort of the market-based strategies, like the use of hybrid or improved varietals, the use of mineral fertilizers, especially the use of mineral fertilizers was very sort of controversial, depending on who you talked to. There were some who were really, really strong supporters and saw this as sort of the way to move forward, and others who were very concerned about the ways that it was being implemented in terms of environmental degradation, or perceived environmental degradation. So the consequences of some of these, so generally we did have relatively high adoption that we saw. So in these 10 villages that we worked in eastern Uganda, about 70% or so of people adopted most of the best management strategies that we were looking at, especially the ones we've talked about today. So it's relatively high adoption. People are adapting. They're choosing to take on these best management strategies to the extent that they can. But it did vary. And one of the interesting results that I want to talk about a little bit is, so one of the things we looked at was, so when people manage, when they adopt a strategy, it's often not just one strategy. They'll adopt a couple, right? They plant trees and they intercrop, or they dig trenches and they have a cow that produces organic manure. And so they use sort of a set of best management strategies. And But what we found was that that wasn't random. Sort of the ways that the sets of strategies that people used wasn't just sort of willy-nilly all over the place, especially with respect to this one set that can be sort of the market strategies and the not market strategies. We saw the strongest relationships seemed to be that there was a set of people who sort of borrowed and chose from the sort of the free strategies, the ones that were just included labor and maybe an allocation of land, like the contouring and the trenching. And then there was a set of people or a set of strategies that seemed to be very strongly linked together, and those were the ones where people were, so that the people who bought mineral fertilizer also used manufactured pesticides, also bought improved varietals of seedlings, and often they also had a cow that produced organic manure on their farm. And these are all, obviously, they're not a random subset, right? These are all ones that cost money. They're things that you have to buy at market. You have to be a little bit wealthier in order to tap into them. And so one of the concerns is that this produces a sort of haves and have-nots of adaptation, that there are some strategies, the free strategies might be sort of open to everyone, but there's a subset of strategies that might only be available to people with just a little bit more wealth and income, and that which strategies you adopt can also change your adaptive capacity over time. That if you're not adopting strategies that are effective at reducing your vulnerability in the short term, you might actually reduce your ability to adapt to shocks over time. But if you have access to lots of different strategies and you're sort of picking and choosing the ones that are most appropriate for you and that are the best sort of use of your resources and the most efficient and effective, that you might be able to increase your adaptive capacity over time, which is what this sort of schema down at the bottom is looking at, taken from a paper of Barry, Smith, and Wendell back in 2006, which is just a sort of basic idea of that you have some meteorological variable that's varying with time, right, the sort of climatic variability, and that there's a trend underlying it. So sort of the historical trends of what the shocks would have looked like, the sort of the peaks and valleys, what they looked like over time is sort of changing, where that is on the climatological scale. And if you're able to increase your adaptive capacity over time by the use of adopting all these strategies, that might still be within your coping zone in future. But if you fail to do that, or even if that band, your coping range narrows over time, more of those peaks or valleys are going to be sort of outside your comfort zone and outside your ability, which over time can sort of narrow it further, and you can get these what I call positive feedback loops of negativity, right? A sort of self-reinforcing system that it makes things worse for you, basically over time. And so there are things we can do with what we know. We can integrate climate adaptation and development. We can make sure that we do sort of climate smart development, make sure that the interventions we have that are addressing vulnerabilities today and climate variability are also able to, that they're robust to climate change, that they improve people's adaptive capacity over time. We should recognize that there is this difference in the resource base, in the capacity base of the populations that need to adapt, that are trying to adopt these mechanisms, and that the strategies that we use to bring those people on board, those might have to be addressed, right? Some people are not going to be able to afford the particular intervention, or they might not have the time or energy. And I talked all about land management strategies today, pretty much, but there are lots of other potential interventions that could be done to increase people's adaptive capacity over time, improve their ability to deal with shocks, system shocks over time. These are two sort of index-based insurance is one, is a sort of financial mechanism, use of mobile technology, a communication mechanism, sort of improving the ability for people to cope around the edges of what they do, and then improving the diffusion of the message and clarity and trust. And the clarity piece is, I think Richard was talking about this a little bit in his talk too, about communication, the importance of communication and getting that message from the scientists at the IPCC and the people who are running these models and determining or projecting what we can expect the future to look like of the climate, and getting that message down in a way that still looks right, sort of, so that when there's an end user at the bottom who has to be managing their land based on that, that message looks the same, sort of like the game of telephone, right? The clearer the message, the simpler, the shorter it is, and the fewer the messengers between, right? The more likely you are to get that message clear at the end, which also requires quite a bit of trust. So there's still some work to be done. We need to research what works, find those success stories, figure out what we're doing right on them so that we can replicate it, or at least test it again to see if, like, okay, it looked right that time, we try it again, does it still produce the correct effects or the effects that we're looking for? research and pilot additional strategies. And my final point is, so there are a lot of organizations that are all working in the same area on the same, or at least an overlapping population of people in the developing world, right? We saw the slide of like all the actors that are all working. Many of them targeting the same goals, the same eventual behaviors, and the horizontal, so the communication between and among those organizations is, at least where I was working, it might not be true everywhere, but was not what it could have been. Lessons learned didn't go from one organization to another. Even people who were trying to achieve the same goal or very comparable goals. And so figuring out how we can get those groups to talk to each other more and learn from each other, because there are lessons, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So with that, I think, yeah, some references if you're interested in thanking my funding sources. So.
And we'd like to open this up for questions, for discussion. We have a couple of people with microphones, or we have one person with a microphone.
But she's very good.
She's got two microphones, and so if you're way over she'll probably toss one to you. But I'd like to ask you to use the mics because we are webcasting this, and I'd like the audience to be on the internet to actually be able to hear questions as well. So, right down here in front.
Thank you. This is a question for Kira. I realize the whole situation is very complex, but has anyone or any of these groups tried to estimate any incremental, economic costs for, achieving some sense of improvement across a community or region? I mean, again, I know it's hard, but are there any rough estimates? And therefore, if there are any estimates of cost, is there any rough sense of the economic benefits?
Okay, so thank you. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, if there are estimates of sort of the cost of achieving a certain amount of benefit in the target community. Not that I've seen estimates of actually, there's a lot of cost tracking in terms of how much a program costs to implement, but some of these benefits, and if you guys have anything to contribute to this.
Well, I mean, I don't know, the production, I assume, is not necessarily all going into a market. A lot of it is for self-consumption.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to think about how you measure the benefits in a case like that, because it's not necessarily going to be measurable in economic terms. But you can look at environmental benefits, you could look at health benefits, even benefits from a sociological perspective. Is it actually reinforcing family structure? Is it enabling people to, have better relations within a community? And so, and certainly those are all things that are documentable. And in some cases, I think in a situation like this, perhaps more easily measured than trying to put a dollar value on something where there's not a market for denominating that.
I think this is probably a question maybe for all three of you, but just in terms of bringing perhaps rather recalcitrant populations to the table to discuss climate change adaptation mitigation, especially Richard, you mentioned that you encounter populations in your work that are affected on a daily basis, but refuse to sort of connect the dots. So you mentioned that you had different approaches in your lines of questioning to bring those people together to at least have a conversation. And I was wondering if you guys could just talk to what those strategies are based on your different lines of research.
Sure, well, I can start with that and say that, I mentioned that a big dividing line seems to be how we attribute events that are happening on the ground. And if we talk about climate change as being something that's human caused, for many people that's still, for whatever reason, whether it's a good reason or a bad reason, something that is more difficult for them to accept. And so a starting point from people's experience, oh, so you're experiencing this much flooding. Oh, so it's going to cause you not to be able to train here or achieve your objective or mission for this particular period of, in which you have these recruits available to you, or it's going to cost you a certain amount to repair the damage. If you can allow those sorts of things to come up from the the people you're working with, it's more based in what they are experiencing, and therefore it is easier for them to accept. And from an adaptation perspective, oftentimes it's those impacts that we have to start from and get people to then have a thought process about how are we going to change how we manage this. What are we going to need to do? Do we need to make a change in put in some piece of infrastructure, a flood wall or something, or is it simply a change in how we're behaving? Is it a management change of some sort? But at least then you're engaging a discussion with them about things that they can relate to and that they feel empowered to implement. I don't want to sound cavalier in dismissing people who have trouble wanting to talk about anthropogenic climate change, because I think for many people they experience this as something that's going to require changes in a way of life that they don't want to give up, and that they see uncertainties in the evidence. Do I come to the same conclusion? No, but I think if we're going to have a dialogue with people, we have to understand where they're starting from if we're going to, in fact, reach them with any sort of communication.
So let me add to that a little bit. I mean, some of my experience comes from having participated in all three of the national climate assessments that the U.S. has done, that the government has sponsored, and a lot of which, or two of which at least, the first one and the last one, actually involved a fair amount of sort of local meetings and discussions and forums to try to address these kinds of questions about what really mattered to people. In general, those experiences were really quite bad if you started out with the lecture about here's climate change and here's why you should care. And they were much more productive if you started off this conversation asking people and actually listening to people talk about what was important to them and what were the kinds of decisions that they were actually having to make, whether it's farming communities or coastal communities or urban situations. And how are those decisions actually affected by changes in weather, by extreme events, and so on. And then you could start to have a dialogue about, well, okay, so here's what we understand about the way the climate system is actually working, and begin to have a discussion over how you think about adapting now and how you might have to think about adapting in the future. But it's similar to how you might approach a discussion about any other sort of polarizing issue, but where decisions nevertheless have to be made.
Yeah, and I would just add, so where I was working, the corollary to the idea of meeting people where they are, no one that I really interacted with was resistant to the idea of climate change at all. Many of them actually, they claim to have seen it. They said the timing of the rains has changed and things like that. But the corollary, I think, comes in with getting people to act. People have different motivations, and so one of the things we saw was sort of some of the more successful programs really did target the idea of co-benefits, that you can do an action, but you don't have to agree on sort of why you're doing it across the whole community. You can, you over there, you can do it for this reason, you over there can do it for this reason. It depends. Are you trying to avoid a risk? Are you seeking a benefit? Are you doing it because your neighbor does it? I mean, all of these things, sort of social pressures, are also pretty important, at least where I was working. And so if you can sort of normalize some of the behaviors, how you get there might not matter as much, at least in the short term. In the long term, you might have to be a little bit more concerned about how robust the changes, those changes that you're making in the community are. But in the short term, getting people to change behavior sometimes, it's meeting them where they are and what their motivations are and what they're trying to achieve already. And then if you can sort of give them the tools to do that in a way that is also meeting this other set of goals, then that's one pathway.
There was a couple.
There's a
in the
couple
middle.
back here, right?
Kira, so you mentioned that in some of these villages, the majority of people have kind of said that they feel like these changes are really making a difference. Mm-hmm. Do you have data that does actually show that it's making a difference?
No. So part of my study, the short answer is no. So the short answer is no if you talk about the outcomes being sort of reduction of risk over time, which is sort of outside the scope of my research question. But if you're talking about empowerment and getting people engaged in a conversation that overall increases their likelihood of adopting mechanisms that in other studies by very intelligent, capable people have shown to be productive over time in reducing risk, then I think that's a beneficial outcome in and of itself, getting people involved in the conversation and getting people to sort of the buy-in of, I can make change, I'm empowered to make change, which is very different from some of the other dialogue that goes on that's very disempowering or unempowering for people in developing nations. That seems sort of like there's this, especially with climate change, that there's this sort of juggernaut coming down the line that they can't do anything about. And in some cases that there are truths to that, but if we assume that people are going to be managing in place and sort of dealing with incremental change, then getting them adopting is a benefit. And there are studies about the benefits of adopting particular best management practices that are out there. My study didn't particularly look at it, but many of the ones that we've talked about here have been shown to be successful. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think there was another question maybe right behind you. Did I see a hand?
Yeah.
Right. Well, this is actually a question that follows up from the previous, not the immediate previous, but the one before that. I'm just curious whether in all the situations where there are clearly divergent interests, are formal conflict transformation methods and trainings part of the training and part of the process of the negotiations that are going on for trying to bring about behavioral change?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what type of methods? You
Conflict
said
transformation methods.
transformation.
I'm thinking about the work, some of the conflict transformation and conflict resolution schools that actually focus on those methods, and also the London-based International Alert that really directly addressed climate change issues at the grassroots level, but entered with the conflict transformation mindset and workshop and techniques. Are these, because we've got a lot of technologies here, are we also using these social technologies?
Yeah, so I mean, in the studies that I've been involved in, that's not really been an approach that's taken. There is a lot that we try to do, kind of in the sense that Tony was talking about it, of understanding what people's objectives are and then trying to work with them to show how there's an interaction between their own objectives and what climate change can result in. In the military anyway, it is more of a command and control kind of environment. And so even though you want people to do what they're doing willingly, at some stage, sometimes it's simply a matter of their understanding that the person above them in the chain is telling them to do it, and they're going to do it, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. So I think for more civil society kinds of settings, I think that what you're talking about is absolutely crucial. There's not so much conflict in these cases as there may be in the ones that I worked in, as lack of acceptance. And so just an illustration that their own objectives are ultimately going to be hindered in some way by these new conditions is often sufficient, even if they're not happy about it, to bring about a behavioral change or change in attitude. So I don't know if I haven't had that much experience in the methods you talk about, although they sound very interesting.
I haven't seen it, actually, for the most part. Particularly in these assessment processes, they tend to operate almost at sort of a different level, sort of evaluating what we know, rather than trying to engage, sort of individual decision makers, as these guys have done in the studies they talked about.
If I can just add one thing, I don't know if you want to add, but so one of the things that we have been working towards, and Tony and I were talking about this last night, is the use of, so a lot of this analysis in the climate modeling community is based on scenarios, different visions of the future about how many people are going to be living in the world, what are they going to be consuming, are we going to have energy efficient technologies or not, and these give rise to different levels of emissions and greenhouse gas forcing and levels of climate change. We've recently adopted a new approach for how we develop those scenarios in the climate and research community that involves identifying different end states, so high and low levels of climate change as end states, say in 2100, and then looking at the different socioeconomic pathways that enable us to achieve those different objectives. It turns out that there's a remarkable coincidence in the underlying logical structure of that new approach in the research community with a very powerful planning technique, scenario planning, that's widely used in communities, where communities, again, a community of individuals, whether it's a town or an association of some sort, will get together and talk about what they want to achieve and set out endpoints for themselves. And so some of us are now working on a set of research projects where we're trying to bring these two different types of scenarios together, because the underlying logical structure is quite similar, and we think is going to be very powerful in enabling us to relate local objectives to these broader environmental and societal outcomes that ultimately are going to provide the context for what they can achieve, even if it doesn't determine in an absolute sense what they can and can't achieve. So I think there's a lot of interest in those sorts of things that can help a community coalesce more around a shared understanding of what their objectives are and how climate change is going to affect them. That, I don't know how similar that is to the sort of method you're talking about, but it sounds similar, at least in objectives, to me.
I have more of an implementation question, sort of building on the modeling. I think the one thing that we're facing in climate change in this future is uncertainty. That's the most certain thing, right? So how do we plan for adaptation with that uncertainty? How do, in your work, Richard, particularly, have you seen strategies that are working for sort of establishing those starting points?
Yeah, well, I think we have, and a lot of them just have to do with building on already extant and applied methods where people already have to work with uncertainty. So a lot of infrastructure planning has to deal with the fact that we don't know exactly what the loads and stresses are going to be, but we can provide a range of those, then people will build to them. And so if we can think about climate change as an additional stress in those kinds of methods, where we're saying it's going to create an additional financial stress, it's going to create an additional physical stress on a piece of infrastructure, then the modeling tasks become mining the climate data for information about the change in frequency or severity of different types of events, and then thinking about how that changed statistical profile of the climate events is going to affect the outcomes that people are caring about, whether those have to do with the a physical stress on infrastructure or a economic cost or a disruption in service, whatever it might be. And so if you can then, even if it's not anything other than a scenario-based sense of probability, you still have some idea of the probability of future events based on the scenario you're choosing, and that sort of information can be integrated into current decision analytic approaches. So I think there is a fair amount that's successful there. People are also trying to move away from using single model results and using the results of a lot of different climate model experiments, something called an ensemble. And those are being successful, but it's just, to me, this integration into existing practice where people already know how to work with uncertainty.
Yeah, the other thing that I'll add to that, Dennis, is that, at some level we have to confront what it is we actually mean by uncertainty, right? So I think about the work that you've done for this vulnerability analysis for BU. And, some of the take-home messages to me are the two big vulnerabilities of essentially sea level rise and flooding, and heat waves. And in each case, a lot of what you might think of as the sort of the scientific uncertainty is also partly determined by the time frame, your planning horizon. And so if, for example, you were primarily worried about the next 2 or 3 decades, there's not that much uncertainty in what will happen to mean sea level rise. And there's a lot of modeling results because you can kind of neglect the big scientific uncertainties about what's going to happen to the Greenland ice sheets or West Antarctica, because those processes are long. If you were trying to build a structure that you thought that you intended to last for 500 years, you would have a different, you might have a very different orientation. I'm hoping that Warren Towers doesn't last for 500 years, but and you can mine the historical data and actually look at existing trends and whether or not they've accelerated and what the actual impacts have been. So to me, one of the real lessons from what Richard talked about was actually the importance of having good quality local information and sort of keeping track of how many times were you out of commission, why did that actually happen, so that you can actually use that information both in operations and maintenance and in new infrastructure. We make decisions with more uncertainty than that all the time, mostly related to our 401ks, where we, in a sense, we trust that on average, these types of, in this case, investment decisions, whose particular futures we can't predict, will generally work out okay for those of us who are not experts over an extended period of time. And so I think it's not a matter of not being able to cope with uncertainty. We actually know how to make decisions under uncertainty, both sort of in the public sphere and the private sphere. But it is a matter of sort of deconstructing which aspects of uncertainty actually matter for the decision at hand. So another one in back here.
Thanks. This question's mostly to Kira to begin with, and then I'll follow up, I think, is for the whole group. But so Kira, similar to your work, I experienced seeing WWF involved with livelihoods work in Tanzania. But I think it's interesting that there's kind of long attention between development and conservation efforts in a lot of the developing world. But now conservation groups are getting into the development game. And part of that is through this argument that they're getting involved with climate adaptation work. Did you get any sense, or was there any concern that development groups were that the conservation groups actually had a certain a priori set of strategies that may have not been tailored to the place, but rather were mainly towards a conservation agenda and not explicitly truly an adaptation or livelihoods agenda, but rather provided a means to enter communities to deal with a certain set of approaches to meet conservation outcomes as opposed to explicitly adaptation or livelihoods outcomes. And just to broaden that, any ways or thoughts regarding if this is a bigger concern of how climate adaptation strategies may be shifting where funds and resources are going in the development world, and shifting the hands of who's moving around the resources for development strategies.
Good set of questions. A lot to work with there. So to attack sort of the first part of what you were asking, sort of the role of conservation organizations moving into the development space and the climate adaptation space, and sort of the motivations and the goals that are there. So in this particular project, so the intervention was very appropriate for the place. It was addressing a risk that was very sort of well established and understood by the communities to be a source of risk for them, and something that they themselves did want to address, which I think partly accounts for the success of the program too, that people were very much engaged in getting it off the ground and agreeing with sort of the outcomes of the project itself. That being said, the village that I was looking at is sort of on the border of the Mount Elgon National Park, which is, the village itself doesn't transcend that border, but it's close. And I know there is quite a bit of work in the conservation world around the edges of that park with concerns about deforestation and the use of sort of the intermittent use of park resources by people who live along the edge. And to the extent to which that factored into identifying which villages to target or which village to target with this particular intervention, I don't know. I didn't get any sense that was one of the goals that was there from the interviews that I conducted. But there's a sort of spatial location there that indicates maybe it did. Maybe they sort of targeted, they may have identified the village based on some of those criteria. But that's speculation. I have no idea if that was actually the case. And the second part of your question, which I should have written down because I've now forgotten it, but
Well, I'll just comment while
Address.
that I've always wanted to give a talk on climate change just using cartoons, because at this point we have so many great cartoons. So the one that comes to mind is the one you've probably seen, where there's some scientists standing up to a big crowd and propounding about climate change, and one of the angry audience members turns to the person next to him and says, "What if we create a better world where we reduce poverty and create universal education and everything is sustainable, and climate change turns out to be a hoax?" And so to some extent, worrying about co-benefits and which benefit is really the biggest is not one I worry about. I do worry about, though, something that you see a lot, which is that people will claim that something is climate smart adaptation without necessarily having done the homework. Mm-hmm. And so you'll find investments, large investments sometimes by organizations like the World Bank and others that really where there has not been the homework done to make sure that the investment is going to result in something that's fit for purpose and fit for conditions over its lifetime. And that's really something that can create not only financial waste, but put people in danger.
So, John, in the spirit of full disclosure, both Richard and I have spent parts of our careers in environmental organizations. In Richard's case, at WWF, and in my case at a think tank, we used to worry about this all the time, that there would be sort of conflation of goals between the conservation movement and development goals. I've come to think that that's, unless you can actually show that those goals are in conflict in some way, it's mostly a waste of time and effort to worry about it. The real key, I think, is to understand when those slightly different motivations actually result in having synergistic goals for the people on the ground. And if you can get to that point, then I think that it becomes a more academic question in the sort of less desirable nuances of that word. You do have to worry, on the other hand, about the sort of greenwashing, and people claiming climate benefits, climate adaptation benefits that don't actually accrue to people on the ground. That's a very serious concern. It's something I expect we're going to hear a lot about in a couple of weeks, when the Conference of the Parties convenes in Paris.
And I did remember one comment that I wanted to make based on sort of the tail end of your question, which was regarding sort of, I think, the allocation of funds to sort of climate projects versus development projects versus conservation projects. And I think, to reiterate some of Tony's point, that there is some like shuffling around of money, right? Like if you can, if you argue that climate change is really the big deal, and so then you end up taking money or shifting money away from other very worthy projects that might even boost adaptive capacity or be adaptive or be climate smart in those other realms, and they shift to just sort of pure adaptation programs, especially if I think that's potentially detrimental, right? If you start to get sort of skirmishes and line drawing, artificial line drawing between those communities, where I think a lot of these sort of potential synergies do exist, I think that would be a shame. But I think it's also very sort of institutionally, it's reasonable to expect that. Institutions do have to sort of guard their own interests, and they tend to. But I think if it's also this opportunity that if we can get the programs that are able to get sort of co-benefits or achieve multiple goals, then that would be sort of the ideal. Yeah, that was just my 2 cents about that.
It's a little bit past 5 o'clock. I'm going to suggest, I'm sure there are more questions and more discussion that people would like to have. I'm going to suggest that we adjourn from this room and move into the foyer where we have a reception set up and pursue those questions and discussion there. Thank you.
Very much so.